Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Richard Nixon is sometimes remembered as the staunch arch-conservative of the 1970s, but his expansion of the welfare state and commitment to the environment surprised a lot of conservatives. Then it turns out that Richard Nixon was full of surprises. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have 5 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to characterize the cultural factor of Americas in the 1970s. You should be able to identify the major policies of the Nixon administration on domestic affairs. You should be able to summarize the steps that Nixon took to stabilize the economy. You should be able to examine Nixon's new approach to the Cold War and explain how Vietnam and Watergate scandals affected the popular trust in government. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 21. The sexual revolution of the 1960s was a countercultural movement that turned into the mainstream by the 1970s. And the carryover of that transition was huge, as divorces soared to 1 million by 1975, doubling the number from nearly a decade before. Birth control and abortion, coupled with a book known as the population bomb, shoved birth rates precipitously low below the replacement rate. Women made inroads in the 1970s into areas which they had been excluded in previous decades. Most notably, Title IX of the Education Amendments Act of 1972 protected women against discrimination in higher education. This is oftentimes most easily recognized in women's athletics, but it's not just limited to sports. Also, AT&T made a huge settlement to pay millions of dollars to workers who suffered sex discrimination and made up making upgraded employment opportunities for women along the way. AT&T, a major employer of the 1970s. Subpoint B. The 1960s countercultural values, when they became mainstream values of the 1970s, really resulted in an unfettered freedom to choose a person's conditions of life, and it came to characterize a self-centered era in American history. It was this self-centered era in American history that the journalist and novelist, and man, what a dresser, Tom Wolfe, called the me decade, as if Americans were mostly interested in themselves. Roman numeral number 22. When Richard Nixon won office in 1968, he won the presidency by a pretty narrow margin. And when he did so, he moved the country towards the center on many issues. He's not quite the arch-conservative that a lot of people consider him to be. I think partially, he knew that he didn't have a strong popular mandate, and so he needed to work with the other side and find middle-of-the-road policies. He hoped to bring order and unity to a country which had been chaotically divided over the Vietnam War. One of Nixon's goals was to decrease the size and influence of the government. His plan was known as New Federalism, and it gave part of federal power to the state and local governments. Nixon proposed revenue sharing, where state and local governments would decide how to spend their money along the way. He created many new agencies, including the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the National Transportation Safety Board. Nixon also backed some social spending increases to win Democratic support. Things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, those programs expanded and people saw increased payments, and food stamps became more accessible. These aren't policies we typically associate with the Republican administration, but perhaps Nixon's most startling initiative was his proposal for the Family Assistance Plan to replace the aid to families with dependent children and to give families a guaranteed minimum income, that they would make a certain amount of money. The plan would give a family of 4 a base income, and if the family had no outside income, then they would receive a federal payment to provide for their families. Eligible families would take job training and basically had to take any reasonable work offered to them. Nixon actually considered this policy to be conservative. Most conservatives today don't think of it that way, but he thought of it the way that it limited government supervision and made recipients basically responsible for themselves. It was defeated in the Senate. Conservatives just objected to the principle of a guaranteed income, and liberals considered the payments too low and insulting to the poor. Government programs that he couldn't axe, though, he impounded their funding, and basically programs that he didn't like, he sort of tied up their cash in the way, making their operation essentially impossible. Subpoint B. Now, Nixon had to achieve some certain political goals, and remember, he doesn't win office with a strong majority, so he's very concerned with bolstering the support that he does have. And he wants to see expanded growth in the South. The South for years had been the old New Deal coalition of voting Democrats. That was beginning to change in the late 1960s and in the 1970s. Part of this has to do with racial policies and desegregation. To consolidate support in the South, Nixon nominated to the Supreme Court a couple of conservative Southern jurists. Now, these guys had support for segregation in their record. Both were rejected by the Senate as unfit for the Supreme Court. When Earl Warren retired from the Supreme Court in 1969, it was Nixon's job to go appoint his replacement, and he appointed Warren Burger to replace him. Burger was expected to lead the justices in a conservative direction, but the Burger court is seen sometimes as a transitional court that consolidated and expanded judicial power most of all. Take, for instance, two cases which are still relevant today. The first one, Schwann versus Charlotte Mecklenburg's Board of Education. Charlotte Mecklenburg was using buses as a tool to achieve desegregation. While school districts had desegregated on paper in compliance with the Brown decision, in reality, there just weren't a lot of black kids in white schools in Charlotte Mecklenburg, just the way the neighborhoods were laid out. So the school district was using buses to take kids from different parts of town to different schools and thus reaching goals of desegregation. That way, when they did so, the protests broke out around the country, but the Supreme Court found that to be a constitutional way to comply with the Brown decision. Or take, for instance, the case of the Regents of University of California versus Bakke, where the court ruled that the University of California system, which had been using quotas to guarantee that a certain amount of its student population were persons of color, they found that the quotas were unconstitutional, that this just created reverse discrimination. However, race could be used as one factor in determining who got into college and who didn't get into college, but it couldn't be like the factor. Subpoint C. Nixon was elected on promises to end the Vietnam War and to end wartime decisiveness, but protests by anti-war liberals dogged his presidency. He began law and order policies to end the riots and appealed to what he called the silent majority of the middle-class Americans who weren't out protesting and generally supported American involvement. And they really wanted order after years of protest and disorder. And so Nixon, encourages the silent majority, but backs it up with law and order policies. Now, for policies known as law and order, some of them weren't very lawful. Take, for instance, wiretapping from members of the Democratic Party or important American liberals. Like the offices of the Democratic Party was in the Watergate Hotel building in Washington, D.C., the Watergate office building. Or using the CIA. The Central Intelligence Agency is the agency in charge of spying on other countries, but the CIA ended up, investigating Americans and compiling documents on thousands of U.S. citizens who objected to government policies. The IRS, which is about collecting taxes fairly, was used as a weapon of harassment to go harass anti-war and civil rights activists. And Nixon even went so far as keeping an enemies list of prominent Americans that the administration would harass along the way. Also, a great example is the vice president, a delightfully named person, Spiro T. Agnew. It's a great name for a person. Anyway, a lot of times in an administration, the vice president is the attack dog of the White House. The president can look presidential and be above the fray, and it's really the vice president who goes in for the kill, and Agnew was great at this. He would go confront anti-war protesters and rebuke the liberal media with stinging barbs, like calling the media an effete corps of impudent snobs. Isn't that great? I mean, this guy was a wordsmith. Or the nattering nabobs of negativism. Spiro T. Agnew, quite a wordsmith. Roman numeral number 23. Nixon also had to deal with some complicated economic policy, which kind of surprised economists, and it was pretty unique in American history, and it's known to us today as stagflation. The economy had gone stagnant, yet was experiencing inflation. In general, you don't find this in economic terms. Inflation comes with good economic times, and When the economy turns down, inflation kind of falls flat. During the 1970s, the long period of post-war economic expansion and consumer prosperity came to an end. And when it did, it was succeeded by years of slow growth, yet high inflation. Under normal circumstances, economists would consider inflation and unemployment to be opposite things. The government could go spur job growth by allowing inflation or limit inflation, even coming at the cost of losing some jobs. But in the 1970s, in the midst of high interest rates and high unemployment, a new problem emerged, that is stagflation. Unemployment was the result of surges in the numbers of workers out competing for fewer jobs. You know, international trade brought competition to U.S. manufacturers, and the United States was losing manufacturing jobs. But at the same time, new workers like the baby boomers were coming into the workforce, as well as women who had long been homemakers were coming into the workforce in pretty significant numbers. That's a lot of workers, but chasing fewer and fewer jobs, and the result is unemployment. In 1971, for the first time in the 20th century, the United States experienced a trade deficit, exporting fewer things than we were importing. And faced with declining profits and rising overseas competition, corporations were eliminating well-paying manufacturing jobs, and the effects on industrial cities were really devastating. The inflation, though, was a little different story. It was largely a result of Johnson's deficit spending on the Vietnam War, coupled with the societal programs of the Great Society. While the Great Society and the War on Poverty were times of economic expansion and a way of trying to spread that growth to the people on the margins, it was a pretty expensive policy. And when the economy started to go down, it was hard to turn off the tap again. The United States had also become dependent on Middle Eastern oil by this point for a decade. And then the Middle East became wildly unstable when the Yom Kippur War broke out between Israel on one side and Egypt and Syria on the other. That was in 1973. The United States came to the side of the Israelis. And that also meant that the United States picked a fight with the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC is an oil cartel that just suddenly shut off exports to the United States, causing gas prices to quadruple and real shortages to appear at the pump. So point B. Nixon tried slashing deficit spending by raising taxes and cutting the budget, saying, all this deficit spending, we got to knock it off, so raise the taxes, that'll help cover the deficit, and then cut the spending on it, that'll help cut the deficit and the other way around. But Congress didn't support the plan. Congress has to be more readily responsive to the voters, and they said this is political nightmare. Nixon then tried to cut inflation by raising interest rates. That's one way to do it. You make money more expensive, and that takes money out of circulation. That did work to cut inflation, but it had the predictable result of worsening unemployment, which I'm not sure that Nixon really had the political clout to go do. In August of 1971, Nixon tried a different approach to control inflation. He ordered price and wage controls, basically freezing incomes and companies' prices for 90 days. Economists don't really like this plan. They think it's a pretty short-sighted approach, but it is one that politicians in general try every now and then. It did ease inflation for a little bit of time, but the recession continued. Nixon also formally ended the gold standard, the old gold standard which William Jennings Bryan had argued about by this point almost a century before, finally reaches its end under the Nixon administration. So the United States dollars would not be redeemable for $1 in gold upon demand. This risked greater inflation, but it also meant that the United States avoided a foreign exchange crisis along the way. Roman numeral number 24. The reality is that Nixon didn't actually like domestic policy all that much. He thought it was fine, something the president needed to do, but his real interest was foreign policy. And I've long believed that if it wasn't for, the Watergate scandal, Nixon's foreign policy approach, we would rank him among one of the greatest presidents in American history. I mean, we don't because of all the other stuff, but Roman numeral number 24. Nixon's real interest was international affairs, particularly to secure an honorable peace in Vietnam while improving relations in China and the Soviet Union. He was largely led by his advisor and Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, first a national security advisor and then later Secretary of State. Kissinger promoted realpolitik, which you might remember if you've ever read The Prince by Machiavelli, as saying that foreign policy should be based on power. We should really evaluate the country as it is, not philosophy or beliefs. That all of the efforts being put into Republican or presidential administrations, I keep saying Republican, put into presidential administrations for years and years to go keep communism from expanding. Things like the containment policies of the Truman or Eisenhower or Kennedy or Johnson years. That meant that we really had a hard time backing down when fights honestly weren't that important to us. And if you look at it, realpolitik, if Vietnam becomes communist, that may suck for the Vietnamese, but Vietnam isn't really a major player. I mean, honestly, is this something that's worth going and getting thousands and thousands of Americans killed over? Kissinger said no, and let's go get out of it. Let's evaluate this thing with real eyes on it. Realpolitik. But if a country was weak, then it's more practical to ignore the country, even if it's communist. Realpolitik was a departure from the containment policy, which refused to recognize communist countries altogether. Under realpolitik, the United States would engage enemy countries in a variety of ways, from negotiations to sanctions to maybe outright war. Nixon and Kissinger developed the policy of détente, easing Cold War tensions by dealing with stated enemies. Maybe the greatest move of the Nixon foreign policy approach was that towards China. When the communist leader Mao Zedong took over China in 1948, the United States basically refused to acknowledge his leadership as legitimate. That the People's Republic of China was an illegitimate country, and the Republic of China, now living in exile on the island of Taiwan, is the rightful ruler of the country. By 1971, Nixon traveled to the country to go normalize relations with the communists. As a result, China agreed to cooperate in disputes and that neither country would try to dominate the Pacific. Also, the countries would have a scientific and cultural exchange. Maybe the greatest example of this was that China allowed for the first time pandas to leave China and ended up in the Washington, D.C. National Zoo. Part of the negotiations was also to recognize what's known as a One China policy, designed to reunite Taiwan back with the mainland. This was a surprise to Taiwan, which had, long been an ally of the United States. When they had split from China in 1945, basically Taiwan looked at the United States for backing, and we got their back until 1971. Today, China, and likewise the United States, consider Taiwan to be a renegade province of China, and officially we don't recognize it as a country. Unofficially, we kind of do, but officially we don't. Perhaps Nixon's real goal in visiting China was actually to exploit a rift between the Maoist style of communism versus Soviet style of communism, where China had been critical of Soviet Union policies. Nixon figured that if the United States and the Soviet Union ever went to blows, it might be kind of nice to have China in your back pocket. Subpoint C. The Moscow Summit of 1972 was a summit meeting between President Richard Nixon of the United States and the Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev. It featured a signing of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty, and also the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the SALT I Treaty, which would limit the number of missiles and warheads to 1972 levels. The summit is considered one of the real hallmarks of détente at the time between the two Cold War antagonists and looked like maybe the Cold War might begin to thaw. Subpoint D. Upon taking office, Richard Nixon announced a strategy for ending the war with a terribly named policy known as Vietnamization. Under Vietnamization, United States troops would gradually withdraw, while South Vietnamese troops would take on more of the fighting and would get U.S. air support to get their back, but to get American troops, the Americanized part of the war, essentially ended, to get American troops home. The policy didn't limit the overall war or limit the war protests. The United States actually ended up escalating the war by invading neighboring Cambodia, surprise Cambodia, in hopes of cutting off their supply routes into Vietnam. The real result was that the United States destabilized the government of Cambodia, collapsing into a brutal Holocaust at the hands of Pol Pot, a 4-year period under the Khmer Rouge that killed 2 million people through political executions and disease and starvation and forced labor, roughly a quarter of the population, and an understudied topic in American history. It's not really American history, but we've kind of got our fingerprints all over it. For as great as Nixon could have been in foreign policy, I think we look at this one as an unmitigated disaster. Anti-war protests, anti-Vietnam War protests climaxed by 1970. Protests at Kent State and Jackson State universities each got students killed by the National Guard and by the police that were now turning on American citizens to go break up what looks like riots. More than 350 colleges exploded into strikes, and troops occupied 21 campuses, including my own alma mater of the University of Kansas, where the student union burned down in Vietnam War protests. Thousands of soldiers deserted the army, wore peace symbols in combat, and veterans were now joining anti-war protests. As public support for the war was rapidly disappearing, mostly on the heels of things like the My Lai massacre, where a company of U.S. troops killed 350 South Vietnamese civilians, kind of for no reason, except that the company just lost their head in the craziness of the war. And also the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were a set of classified reports which were published by the New York Times. Now, classified means it should have never reached the newspapers, much less be published by the New York Times. And it traced United States involvement in Vietnam all the way back to World War II, revealing how several presidents of the United States had misled the public into what seemed like an inevitable march into a losing war in Southeast Asia. Congress also passed the War Powers Act of 1973, which ultimately limited the presidential power to send troops into battle without congressional permission. And all of this led us to subpoint E of the end of the Vietnam War, ending with, no surprise to me, the Paris Peace Agreement, making possible the final withdrawal of American troops in 1973. Under the terms of the Paris Peace Agreement, South Vietnam would continue to exist even if it was partially occupied by the North and the Viet Cong. When the United States pulled out after the military presence left, the North predictably invaded, forcing the United States to evacuate its embassy and ultimately abandon the South in a dramatic scene of people fleeing to the rooftops of the American embassy to be evacuated by helicopter as the Viet Cong closed in. The Vietnam War was a military, political, and social disaster and one of the great mistakes in American history. Roman numeral number 25. Speaking of great mistakes, Nixon had surrounded himself with a small and loyal group of advisors. Like the president, this inner circle desired secrecy and power, bringing the criticism that they were ultimately above the law. They included Nixon's chief of staff, his attorney general, his chief domestic advisor, his presidential counsel, then a variety of others, who all played key roles in Nixon's 1968 electoral win before helping to direct White House policy. Their sense that they were above the law led Nixon and his advisors into covering up their role in Watergate. Subpoint B. At 2:30 a.m., a guard at the Watergate office building caught 5 men breaking into the campaign office of the Democratic National Committee. The burglars intended to photograph papers of the Democratic Party's national strategy and to wiretap the telephones. The burglars were coordinated by the Committee to Re-elect the President, with an unfortunate nickname of Creep. Nixon's re-election organization. The Watergate scandal was the break-in, though. The break-in wasn't the scandal. The cover-up is always worse than the crime. That's a good life lesson for you. Very quickly, workers in the Committee to Re-elect the President office began shredding any kinds of documents, using the CIA to go pressure the FBI to go stop their investigation, and to use election funds to go bribe burglars into science. All of this highly illegal. The Watergate burglary originally got very little attention in 1972, except for 2 newspaper reporters for the Washington Post who would become really important and today famous, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. The Washington Post ran a series of articles linking numerous members of the administration to the burglary, all of which was formally and strictly denied by the White House. Nixon was reelected in a landslide that year in 1972 over the liberal George McGovern. Subpoint C. Judge John Sirka presided over the trial of the burglars and made it very clear that he didn't think that the burglars acted alone. After the burglars were convicted, former CIA officer James McCord admitted that he'd lied under oath about coordinating the break-in and said that many White House advisors were actually pretty directly involved in it. McCord's admission piqued public interest, and Nixon acted fast to cover it all up. He fired White House counsel John Dean, that's the head government lawyer, and he forced others to resign. Throughout the summer of 1973, Americans watched the president's men testify one after another. John Dean was grilled by Congress, asking, "What did the president know and when did he know it?" over and over. And he declared that eventually that Nixon was personally involved in the cover-up. Another presidential aide said that Nixon had basically taped all of his conversations with the people, allegedly so Nixon could go write his memoirs, but all of those tapes have all of the evidence that you would need to blow this thing wide open. Subpoint D. Now, unrelated to Watergate, this is meanwhile, back at the ranch, unrelated to Watergate, it was discovered that Vice President Spiro T. Agnew had been accepting bribes back when he was the governor of Maryland. Agnew had pleaded no contest and resigned along the way. It has nothing to do with Watergate except the fact that it's just further proof that Nixon is really bad about picking the people closest to him. The vice president resigns. Under the 25th Amendment, how do you fix that? So the president will make a nomination who should be his vice president, and the Senate would need to go confirm it. So Nixon nominated and Congress confirmed Gerald Ford as vice president. Ford was a popular and trustworthy U.S. congressman. He was an Eagle Scout, literally was an Eagle Scout. He was a Navy veteran. He was squeaky clean. And that was just the kind of guy that Nixon needed to have in his, administration. Subpoint E. But, okay, so now, let's go back to the Watergate story. The special prosecutor appointed to investigate the case went and subpoenaed for the tapes. Basically got a court order to go that Nixon needed to turn over these audio tapes. Nixon refused to turn them over, and then he ordered his attorney general to go fire the prosecutor. They're like, listen, this guy all works for all of this is executive branch, so Attorney General, you work for me, go fire that prosecutor who's investigating me. The Attorney General refused to do that. They said, no, that's not the way the Justice Department works, and that you've made me do that compromises my position, and he resigned his office. The Deputy Attorney General then, Nixon says, well, then you fire him, and the Deputy Attorney General also refused. And also resigned. The third in charge of the Justice Department did fire the prosecutor, but appointed a replacement who subpoenaed the tapes. It looks like all of these things that Nixon's going to be forced to go turn him over. Subpoint F. In March of 1974, a grand jury indicted 7 presidential aides on charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and perjury. Nixon said on television that he would not release the tapes, but he would turn over the transcripts. A little over 1,200 pages of transcripts, he said, which would be edited because they include national security issues and after the scandal of the Pentagon Papers, that just isn't the kind of thing you're going to put in the newspapers. In July, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously. It's not usually the thing that the Supreme Court would go rule unanimously. Particularly some of these people are Nixon's appointees, but unanimously ruled that Nixon had to surrender the tapes. Even the president can't withhold evidence involving criminal activity. Subpoint G. Even before they got the physical tapes, the House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Impeachment. Now, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with what it means to impeach a president. It's not to remove him from office. To impeach means to be a charge from the House of Representatives that the president is unfit for office. It's the first round of removing a president. Then it goes to the United States Senate, who could vote to convict them. So a president may be impeached but not removed. We saw that with Johnson right after the Lincoln administration. Johnson was impeached by the House but retained by the Senate. We saw it in the Clinton administration, who was impeached by the House but not removed by the Senate. And we saw it 2 times in the Trump administration, impeached by the House but not removed from the Senate. In this case, the House has drawn up impeachment charges against Nixon. So Nixon released the tapes, which showed that he knew of the administration's role in the burglary and in its cover-up. But before the House of Representatives could actually vote on impeachment, Nixon resigned office. He's the only president to ever go quitsies on an office. He was going to be impeached and almost certainly going to be removed from office, but before they got the chance, Nixon resigned from office along the way. He's the only person to ever resign from office, and that takes Gerald Ford, who was never even elected as vice president, Gerald Ford suddenly becomes the president. He's the only person to hold the presidency without ever winning a national election. Ford quickly issued a pardon to Nixon, hoping to put all of the disgrace to rest. His famous line was that our long national nightmare is over, and let's just move on from this thing. All in all, 25 members of the Nixon administration were convicted and imprisoned, none of which were Nixon. He was pardoned and got away with it. The longer consequences of the turmoil of the Vietnam years and the Watergate scandal was that Americans had lost their faith in government, cementing the thinking that all politicians are dishonest and corrupt. And that's kind of a story that hangs around with us today, that we think that even though certain politicians might be good, as a whole we don't like them, and politicians we don't expect to solve our problems. We think they're just going to make new problems for us. Those problems, though, are a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you more about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.